So today we're talking about soils and the importance of soils in natural resources. So when we think about soils, one of the people we want to think about is the naturalist Aldo Leopold and kind of how he saw soils. And one of the things that he said was that all natural resources are soil or derivatives of soils. Farms, crops, forests, livestock, and wildlife resolve themselves into questions of soil. Soil, therefore, is the basic natural resource. Soil is the foundation of natural resources. It's everything in terms of natural resources. Without soil, without this whole process where we start everything, there is no food chain or food web. You need the soil before you get to anything else. Let's back up a second. There we go. So, soil, as defined in the dictionary, the upper layer of earth that may be dug or plowed and in which plants grow. Dirt, however, is a substance such as mud or dust that makes things unclean. Therefore, soil and dirt are not the same thing. When we're talking about soil, we're talking about a natural resource. We're talking about something that's fertile, something that things grow in. Dirt is dead soil. It's not a living environment. It doesn't have the microorganisms within it. It doesn't have organic matter. It's just dead soil. Now, can you add water and organic matter to dirt and turn it back into fertile soil? Yes, absolutely. But for our case, soil and dirt are not saying the same thing. When we're talking about soil and we're talking about natural resources, we're using soil, not dirt. So, how else can we talk about soil? Soil is a dynamic, living, natural body capable of supporting vegetative cover. So, when we're thinking about soil, we're thinking about the idea that that's where everything grows. It's the ground upon which we grow everything. And in terms of what we talked about earlier with ecological principles and the idea of producers and consumers, we don't have producers and consumers without the soil. And so where there's no soil, there is no plant life. And we kind of talked about that with the idea of primary succession. And so in this area specifically, if you go deep enough, what we get to is a layer of bedrock of granite. So in the Sierra Nevada region, the Central Valley, basically you go deep enough, you're just going to hit one big layer of granite. And if you don't know what that looks like, think about Yosemite National Park and think about El Capitan and just that's a big piece of granite. So basically under all of the Sierra Nevadas, if you go deep enough, you're going to see something that looks like El Capitan or Half Dome. So when we think about soil is made up of 4 parts. And to me, it's very interesting and it's really important in the way that soil works that you understand the 4 parts. So you've got a quarter of soil being just air and room for air, a quarter of soil being filled with water, and then 45% of it is mineral particles. And that mineral particles is a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. And we'll talk about that in a slide to come. And then 5% of it is organic matter. And that's going to depend on age and location. And when we're talking about that organic matter, majority of it is humus, which is partially decayed material. It's basically when you think about all the stuff that's going to hit the forest floor. So animal excrement, dead animals, leaves, twigs, all that sort of stuff. And once it just finally hits the ground and starts to become something where it's not quite soil yet, but you also can't say, well, oh, that was a twig, or that you're just kind of unsure as to what it looks like. That's humus. And not hummus, not the dessert stuff. There's not 2 M's, there's 1 M, so it's humus. And then also in your organic matter, you're going to get organisms and roots. And so it's really important to understand when we say soil as opposed to dirt, and we say that it's a living natural resource. It's this idea of this mixture of organic matter and mineral particles, and then air and water. The idea that there's always room and it's always changing in terms of this amount of air and water in there really lets you kind of understand that it's a dynamic system. So there's going to be a few things with soil that we focus on. I teach a whole class in soil, so obviously there's plenty to talk about, but we're going to keep it just as an introduction to soil. So we're going to focus on texture, structure, organic matter content, nutrients, and acidity, specifically focusing on pH. And so when we're looking at these things, and why look at these things, it's because these are going to help us determine what plants can and cannot grow in certain areas, how quickly plants are going to be able to grow. So are they going to grow fast? Are they going to grow slow? How much biomass those plants can produce, their susceptibility to erosion and water movement, and the suitability for roads and for buildings. So are they going to be strong enough to actually be the foundation for something? And so when we start thinking about, okay, well, what do we use soil for? Well, we want to grow plants in it. We want to know how quickly we can grow plants. We want to know how much we can get out of it. We want to know if the soil will disappear or have problems, and we want to know if we can build buildings and build roads on it. That's everything, right? That's everything that we do with that natural resource. And so we're going to get that information by looking at these chemical and physical properties. So in terms of our soil texture, the one thing to really understand with soil texture is that every soil is made up of a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. So sand, of these three particles, sand is the only one that's large enough for us to actually see. So just think of like going to the beach and just the idea of sand. So that's, of these three type particles that make up every soil, that's the biggest one. We also have silt, which is smaller than sand particles. Silt feels kind of powdery like flour, and it doesn't hold well together when wet. And then we have clay, which are the smallest soil particles, but they have a very high water holding capacity. They're smooth and sticky when wet. And the go-to I always go to when I'm talking about clay is the idea of Play-Doh. A lot of us growing up played with Play-Doh, and that is basically a very clay like texture. It's small particles, very, very small particles, can't even see them, but you stick them all together and they stick well together, and they can hold water, and they can do all sorts of things and be molded into a lot of different ways. But the real key idea I want you to get out of this is that every soil, every single one of them, and there's tons of different ones, every soil is made up of a mixture of sand, silt, and clay. So, in terms of texture, why should we know soil texture? Well, the big things about it that why we want to know the soil texture is we want to know the water holding capacity. We want to know if it's going to hold water. So, is the water going to drain out of the soil, or is it going to stay in the soil? Aeration, we want to know, is there going to be room for air, or is it going to be filled with mostly water? And then it can also influence the organic matter content. So how much organic matter we can see in there because of the idea of how much water is going to be there. So one way they do that is this soil texture triangle. And I don't expect you guys to be experts at the soil texture triangle or use it, but I want you to just get this idea that every type of soil is going to be sand, silt, and clay. So we talked about that part. So what we kind of look at in terms of a perfect blend of sand, silt, and clay, and the influences of each of those types of particles, is a loam soil. And this idea of a loam soil becomes really important in the Central Valley because that's the soils we have here, and those are good agricultural soils. And so that's part of the reason why farming is so good in the Central Valley and why people settled in this area to become farmers, because of the loam soils that we have here. So why is a loam soil better than the other ones? Well, let's start off on the top right here by looking at clay. Okay, clay is very small particles. It has high water holding capacity but low mobility. And when it says low mobility, that means water moving through the soil. So what I want you to think about is anytime you see a lake or you see water building up like a river, anything like that where you can see water above the ground, there's clay, a very high clay content in that soil. Because the idea is that clay can hold water really well. Like think about a clay pot, or think about Play-Doh, where you can make a little divot in it and it would just sit there and it would hold the water, right? So it will hold water. But the idea of water moving through the system and being able to get to the different layers of the soil, which we'll talk about in a little bit, it does not move through the soil very fast. It can sit there on the soil, but it doesn't go anywhere. And so what that means is there's less water available to the plants due to the low mobility. Well, then let's look at the bottom left hand of this slide and we'll talk about pure sand then. Sand is large particles. They have very low water holding capacity. So think about the beach. When the water comes in to the sand on the beach, the water comes in, hits the sand, and then you just watch the water go right through the sand. And it doesn't stay there at all. It's got very low water holding capacity, but it's got high water mobility because the water comes pouring right through the sand. It goes right in and right into the system, right? The wave comes in, water sits there, and then it's gone. It's right into the system. But that means that it's got very poor storage of the soil or of water, because the water quickly drains out of the root zone. The roots are only going to be in the top 6 to 8 inches. And so because of that, the water goes and drains right through that quickly. So pure clay is not great for plants, but really good at holding water. Pure sand is not good at holding water, but is really great at getting water to things quickly. So then what about silt? Well, silt has small particles. It has low to mid water holding capacity, low to mid mobility, and less water available to plants due to low holding capacity and mobility. So silt can hold water kind of okay, and it can move water kind of okay, because it's not sand and it's not clay, but it's not great either. But loam, which you see with the star towards the center of the soil texture triangle, loam is a blend of those particle sizes. It has high water holding capacity. It's got good water mobility, so it's got good storage and good availability to plants. So not only can it hold water, but it actually makes water available to the plants, and so that it really gets water to the plants and can hold a lot of water, so it can let the plants have water constantly and grow. And so a loam soil becomes your best texture if you're trying to grow plants. So when you're looking for ag soils, they're looking for some sort of a blend of loam, just a regular loam or the silt loam, clay loam, sandy clay loam, sandy loams, somewhere in there to where they have this good blend of particle sizes where they can get some good water holding capacity, but also good water mobility so that the plants can get the water. In terms of soil structure, this really gets back to what we were talking about with the 4 parts of soil, where you've got half of soil being air and water. And so in a well-structured soil, there's room between the pores of the little soil particles. So you want it to where if you have a well-structured soil, you've got nice air or nice pores open for the air and the water to move in and out really easily in the pieces of soil. And when that happens, then it's easy for water to move in the system. It's easy for air to move in and out of the system, and the system functions really well. If you have poorly structured soil, so like how could you have poorly structured soil? Well, one easy example for us is compaction. So if you get vehicles on a road, or you get a lot of cows or people walking through a specific area, then the soil becomes poorly structured. The pores are small. There's not a lot